Hi everyone. Before we get started, I have a quick question for you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? I always enjoy reading your comments from different countries. If these stories help you drift off to sleep, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let me tell you tonight's story. I moved to a new neighborhood outside Denver back in March. Into a small 2-bedroom house I'd bought entirely on my own after years of renting apartments in the city. It was the first real house I'd ever owned, and I was proud of it in that quiet, slightly nervous way. You're proud of something you're not entirely sure you know how to take care of yet. One of the first things I did, maybe 2 weeks after moving in, was introduce myself to the neighbors on either side. On my left was a young couple with a toddler, friendly, but clearly buried in the particular exhaustion of early parenthood. On my right was an older man named Walter, retired, somewhere in his early 70s, who'd apparently lived on that street longer than almost anyone else. He was the kind of neighbor who waved from his porch every morning, who mentioned the names of the previous 3 families who'd lived in my house like he was reciting a small local history nobody had asked him for. It was Walter, in fact, who suggested the spare key. Always good to have someone close by holding one, he said, one Saturday while we were both out doing yard work, in case you get locked out or something happens and someone needs to get in and check on you. My wife and I did this with every neighbor we ever had, God rest her. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable, even old-fashioned kind of neighborly gesture, the sort of thing I associated with a slower, more trusting era than the one I'd grown up in. I cut a spare key at the hardware store that week and dropped it off at his door with a small thank you note for helping me identify a leak in my kitchen faucet the week before. He seemed genuinely touched by it, tucking the key into a labeled hook just inside his front hallway, right next to what looked like several other keys on similar hooks, other neighbors, I assumed. Other small gestures of trust extended over however many years he'd lived on that street. For the first couple months, nothing about it crossed my mind at all. Walter waved, I waved back, and life in the new house settled into its own unremarkable rhythm. Work, groceries, slowly filling empty rooms with furniture I could actually afford. It was sometime in May that I first noticed something small enough that I almost didn't register it as anything at all. I'd left a stack of mail on my kitchen counter one morning before work, weighted down under a coffee mug the way I always left it, and came home that evening to find the stack moved, not far, just shifted a few inches to the left, angled slightly differently than I remembered leaving it. I told myself I'd probably bumped it myself on my way out, in the general morning rush of getting ready for work. It's the kind of small domestic detail that's easy enough to misremember, easy enough to explain away with your own distracted carelessness rather than anything more concerning. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 weeks. The next thing I noticed, about 2 weeks later, was harder to explain away quite so easily, though I still managed it, at least for a while. I'd come home from a long day at work, later than usual, and gone straight to the kitchen to make myself a coffee before starting dinner. My coffee maker, a fairly basic drip machine I'd had for years, was still warm to the touch when I picked it up. Not hot, not freshly brewed, but warm in that specific lingering way. Appliances stay warm for maybe 20 or 30 minutes after actually being used. I hadn't used it that morning. I remembered clearly, because I'd been running late and grabbed coffee from the shop near my office instead. Something I only did maybe once a week, specific enough that I was fairly confident in the memory. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, hands still resting on the warm carafe, running through every possible explanation. Maybe I actually had made coffee that morning and simply forgotten in the rush. Maybe the machine retained heat longer than I realized. Some quirk of an aging appliance I'd never had reason to notice before. Neither explanation felt entirely satisfying, but neither did the alternative I wasn't ready to consider yet. So I made myself a cup, ate dinner, and mostly let it go. It was the television that made the whole thing harder to dismiss. I'd been half watching a documentary one evening when I noticed, scrolling back through my streaming service's recently watched list out of idle curiosity, several titles I didn't remember selecting at all. A cooking show, 2 episodes of some true crime series I'd never had any interest in, all logged as watched on a Tuesday afternoon when I'd been at work the entire day, nowhere near my house. I sat with the remote in my lap for a long moment, scrolling up and down that list, trying to convince myself of some reasonable explanation. Maybe the streaming algorithm glitched and logged things incorrectly. Maybe I'd left the TV on by accident before leaving for work. Some episode auto-playing to an empty room all day while I was gone. It was possible. It felt thin, even as I told it to myself, but it was possible. I mentioned it, lightly, to my friend Danielle over drinks that weekend, mostly as a strange little anecdote, rather than a real concern. "Girl, you probably just don't remember," she said, laughing. "You've been slammed at work. You said so yourself. Your brain's probably just fried." It was a reasonable thing for her to say, and I let myself believe it, mostly for the rest of that evening. I've always trusted my own memory more than most people, if I'm honest. But even I have to admit that exhaustion does strange things to a person's certainty about small details. Still, walking home that night, slightly buzzed from one too many glasses of wine, I found myself doing the math on my own schedule that week without quite meaning to. Through the coffee maker, the TV history, both incidents falling on days I'd been out of the house for the entire working day. Both incidents involving things that would require someone physically present in my home to account for. I didn't like where that math was leading me. I pushed it out of my head before I got all the way home. I checked my doorbell camera footage the following week, more out of a nagging unease than any real expectation of finding something. It was one of those smart video doorbells, motion activated, supposedly capturing anyone who approached my front porch. I scrolled back through the footage from the days in question, the coffee maker morning, the TV afternoon, and found nothing. No visitors, no deliveries, nothing but the occasional car passing on the street. And once, briefly, a squirrel crossing the porch railing. Part of me felt relieved seeing that empty footage. If no one had come to my door, then surely nothing had actually happened inside. And the coffee maker and the TV history were exactly the kind of small, explainable oddities Danielle had suggested. Fatigue, misremembering, and aging appliances quirks. But another part of me, quieter and harder to shake, noted something else about that footage. The camera only covered the front porch and the walkway leading up to it. It had never once occurred to me, in the months I'd had it installed, to wonder what it didn't cover. The back door, off the kitchen, that led out to a small fenced yard. Accessible from a side gate that I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd checked was locked. I checked that gate the next morning before work and found it closed, latched, apparently secure. I told myself that settled the matter, mostly because I badly wanted it to. It was around this time that Walter mentioned something over the fence one evening, in his usual easy, conversational tone that I only registered as strange much later, turning it over after everything else that followed. "You've been keeping busy," he said, watching me struggle with a stubborn weed near my porch steps. "Working a lot of late nights lately, seems like." "Yeah, it's been a rough stretch," I said, not thinking much of it. "How'd you know that?" He just smiled, the easy, grandfatherly smile I'd come to associate with him over the past few months. "Oh, you can just tell," he said. "Lights on later than usual, that sort of thing." It was a plausible enough answer. Porch lights, bedroom lights, visible from his own yard if he happened to glance over in the evening. I didn't think much more of it at the time. For almost 3 weeks after that, nothing happened at all. No moved mail, no warm coffee maker, no strange entries in my watch history. I let myself relax, gradually. The tension I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying easing out of my shoulders bit by bit. I told myself, by the end of that quiet stretch, that I'd genuinely been overreacting to a string of unrelated coincidences amplified by stress and exhaustion, exactly the way Danielle had suggested. That relief lasted right up until the night I came home unexpectedly early from a work trip that had been cut short and found my bedroom closet door standing open, not the way I ever left it. Doors pushed back fully against the wall. My clothes shifted slightly on their hangers as though someone had gone through them, item by item, looking for something, or simply looking. I stood in my bedroom doorway for a long moment, staring at that open closet, feeling my heart pick up in a way that made the room seem suddenly too quiet, too still. Nothing appeared to be missing. I checked, methodically, going through drawers and jewelry box and the small lockbox where I kept important documents, and found everything exactly where it should be, untouched, undisturbed, except for that one open door and the faint, unmistakable sense that someone had stood in that exact spot going through my things. I called Danielle that night, later than I probably should have, and this time she didn't laugh it off quite the way she had before. "Okay, that's actually creepy," she admitted. "Have you checked if anyone has a key? Landlord? Previous owner? Anything like that?" I hadn't thought about it that directly before, and the question sat with me uncomfortably as I ran through everyone who might reasonably have access. And it was in that moment, lying awake that night, that I thought of Walter's key, hanging on that labeled hook in his front hallway, alongside however many others belonging to however many other trusting neighbors over however many years. I didn't want to think it. I want to be honest about that. Walter had been nothing but kind since I'd moved in, helped me find a good plumber, brought over a casserole my first week, waved every single morning without fail. The idea that he might be behind any of this felt genuinely disloyal to even consider, let alone voice out loud to anyone. But I couldn't stop thinking about it either. Once the thought had actually formed, I lay awake calculating, uncomfortably, exactly how much time had passed since I'd handed him that key, matching it up against when the strange incidents had actually started. And the timeline fit, uncomfortably well, close enough that I couldn't dismiss it as easily as I wanted to. I didn't confront him. I didn't know what I would even say, how I would frame a suspicion that sounded, even in my own head, deeply paranoid and more than a little insulting to a man who'd shown me nothing but neighborly warmth since the day I moved in. Instead, I did something quieter. I bought a small indoor camera, the kind meant for keeping an eye on pets or checking in on an empty apartment, and installed it in my living room, angled to cover both the front door and the hallway leading toward my bedroom, tucked discreetly on a bookshelf where it wouldn't be immediately obvious to anyone glancing around the room. I told myself I was probably about to feel foolish. I told myself the footage would show nothing at all, that I'd wasted $40 proving to myself that my own tired, overworked brain had simply been playing tricks on me for weeks. For the first 4 days, that's exactly what the footage showed. An empty, undisturbed living room. Nothing moving except the occasional shift of afternoon light through the blinds. I started to feel genuinely embarrassed about the whole thing. Imagining explaining the camera to Danielle as an overreaction, I was quietly walking back. On the 5th day, I checked the footage the moment I got home from work, coffee mug still in hand from that morning, and felt my stomach drop somewhere. It hadn't dropped to yet in this entire strange stretch of weeks. The footage timestamp read 11:42 a.m., a Tuesday, a day I'd been at my desk at work the entire time, nowhere near my house. I watched my own front door open, slowly, without anyone knocking or ringing the bell first, without any of the ordinary hesitation of a visitor unsure whether someone was home. A key. I could see it clearly, even in the slightly grainy footage. A hand inserting a key into the lock, turning it with the easy, practiced motion of someone who'd done this many times before, someone entirely unbothered by the possibility of being caught in the act. The door opened, and Walter stepped inside. I didn't rush. He didn't glance around nervously the way you'd expect from someone doing something they knew was wrong. He simply walked into my living room, hands in his pockets, moving with the same unhurried, comfortable gait I'd watched him use in his own front yard 100 times, and stood there for a moment, looking around the room the way you'd look at a space you were considering redecorating. Then he walked further in, toward the hallway leading to my bedroom, out of the camera's field of view entirely, and didn't reappear in frame again for nearly 40 minutes. I sat on my kitchen floor watching that footage, laptop balanced on my knees, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with fear exactly, not yet, something closer to a specific, sickening kind of betrayal. The particular horror of discovering that someone who'd waved at you every morning, who'd brought you a casserole, who'd handed you gardening advice over a shared fence, had also been walking freely through your private space the entire time, going through your closets, standing in rooms he had no reason to be in, while you were at work believing your house was simply, quietly empty. When he finally reappeared in frame, walking back toward the front door, he paused for just a moment near my bookshelf, the same shelf where my new camera sat, tucked just barely out of casual sight, and looked directly toward it. Not at it, exactly. Near it. A slow, searching glance across that section of shelf that made my whole body go rigid watching it later, uncertain whether he had actually spotted the camera or whether it was simply an old man's aimless gaze, wandering across a room before he let himself back out my own front door and locked it carefully behind him. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with that footage open on my laptop for hours, watching it over and over, trying to understand what I was looking at. Not a burglar, not someone rifling through drawers for valuables, but a man moving through my home with the calm, unhurried familiarity of someone who felt he had every right to be there. I didn't call the police that first night. I want to be honest about how long it actually took me to get there, because in the moment, it didn't feel like an obvious next step the way it probably should have. It felt, instead, like something that needed to be absolutely certain before I turned it into something official. Some deep, ingrained reluctance to accuse a kind, elderly neighbor of anything, even with footage sitting right there on my laptop that left very little room for alternate explanations. Instead, I watched. For the next several days, I checked that camera footage obsessively, every evening the moment I got home, cataloging every visit with a kind of grim, methodical precision that felt necessary, even as it made me feel a little unhinged doing it. He came back twice more that week. Same pattern each time, mid-morning, mid-afternoon. Always on days he could reasonably have assumed I'd be at work. Always entering with that same key, moving through my house with the same unhurried calm. He never took anything, as far as I could tell. Cross-referencing carefully against every drawer and shelf. He simply walked through rooms. Sat once in my living room armchair for almost 10 full minutes, hands resting on the armrests, looking around at nothing in particular, the way you'd sit in a room that was entirely, comfortably yours. The stillness of it was the part I couldn't shake. If he'd been stealing things, rifling through my belongings with obvious purpose, some part of me might have found it easier to categorize. A burglar, a thief, an ordinary criminal motive I could understand and report accordingly. But this felt like something else entirely. Something without a name I was comfortable using. A kind of patient, undisturbed occupation of a space that wasn't his. Conducted with the calm of someone who'd never once considered the possibility of being caught. I finally called the non-emergency police line on a Thursday. Footage saved across 2 separate devices by then. Hands steadier than I expected once I actually started talking. The officer who took my statement listened carefully, asked several clarifying questions about the timeline, and told me they'd need to review the footage themselves before deciding how to proceed. Given that no theft had actually occurred, and the legal specifics around a neighbor using a voluntarily given spare key were, in her words, a bit more complicated than a straightforward break-in. But he shouldn't be in there when I'm not home and don't know about it, I said, hearing my own voice shake slightly for the first time since I'd started explaining any of this. That has to count for something. It does, she assured me. We'll need to talk to him directly. Do you want to be present for that? Or would you rather we handle the initial conversation on our own? I told her I'd rather not be there. I didn't think I could stand across from Walter's easy, grandfatherly smile and hear whatever explanation he'd come up with for walking through my home like it belonged to him. 2 officers went to Walter's house the following afternoon, while I sat in my own kitchen, blinds drawn, feeling a strange, unsteady mix of vindication and dread I hadn't fully prepared myself for. I watched, through a narrow gap in my curtains, as the patrol car pulled up outside his house, and I remember bracing myself for something dramatic. Raised voices, a scene, some visible confirmation that I hadn't imagined the wrongness of any of it. Instead, what I saw was almost worse. Walter opened his door for the officers with the same easy, welcoming expression he greeted everyone with. Invited them inside without any visible hesitation at all. The posture of a man who either had absolutely nothing to hide or had spent so long believing he didn't, that the distinction no longer occurred to him. I was inside talking with them for nearly 2 hours when one of the officers came to update me afterward. Her expression was careful in a way that told me before she even said anything that this wasn't going to resolve as simply as I'd hoped. He didn't deny it, she told me. Says he's been checking on the house periodically, out of what he described as an abundance of neighborly concern. Says he's done the same for several other people on the street over the years, always with a spare key they gave him voluntarily. And he genuinely didn't understand why anyone would find it alarming. He was in my closet, I said, going through my clothes, sitting in my chair. That's not checking on a house. I know, she said. And legally, entering without express permission each time, even with a key you were given, does cross a line. We're citing him for unlawful entry. But I want to be honest with you. This isn't likely to result in serious charges, given there's no theft, no property damage, nothing beyond the entry itself. He's cooperating fully. Seems entirely unbothered by any of it, honestly, which is its own kind of unsettling. I won't pretend otherwise. I asked her what several other people on the street meant exactly, and she told me, carefully, that they'd need to follow up separately with the other neighbors he'd mentioned, that it wasn't something she could speak to in detail yet. I didn't sleep at all that night, turning that phrase over endlessly. Several other people on the street said in the same calm, unbothered tone Walter himself always used, as though this were simply a habit he'd maintained across years and multiple households, without ever once considering it might be anything other than perfectly ordinary. The follow-up came 4 days later, and it was more than I'd braced myself for. An officer called to let me know they'd conducted a more thorough search of Walter's property after 2 other neighbors, once approached, admitted to similar unexplained oddities they'd each quietly dismissed on their own. A moved lamp, a television left faintly warm, small things easy enough to explain away individually, exactly the way I had. until someone else's confirmed experience made the pattern impossible to keep dismissing. In his garage, tucked into a locked metal filing cabinet that Walter apparently hadn't expected anyone to ask about, officers found an actual second, duplicate copy of my house key, cut separately from the one I'd given him, hidden away rather than kept on the labeled hook in his front hallway alongside the others. And alongside that duplicate key, in a plain manila folder, they found photographs, dozens of them, printed at a local pharmacy according to the receipts found with them, dated across the months since I'd moved in. My living room, my kitchen, my bedroom, methodically documented from multiple angles. The kind of photographs you'd take if you were cataloging a space rather than simply passing through it. Some of them showed small changes over time, furniture rearranged slightly between shots, decorations added as I'd slowly settled into the house, as though he'd been tracking the evolution of my home, the way you'd track a project that belonged, in some private, unspoken way, to you. The officer told me, with careful diplomacy, that similar folders existed for at least 2 other addresses on the street. The young couple next door, and an elderly widow 3 houses down, who'd lived there even longer than Walter had, whose photographs, based on the dates on the receipts, went back nearly a decade. A decade. I sat with that number for a long time after the call ended, trying to reconcile it with the easy, grandfatherly man who'd waved at me every single morning since I moved in, who'd never once, in any interaction I'd had with him, given me the slightest reason to suspect anything beneath that warmth. What happens now? I finally asked, when I called back for clarification the following day. He's been charged with unlawful entry across multiple properties, the officer said. Given his age and the lack of any theft or property damage, I won't lie to you. The sentencing, if it even goes that far, is likely to be lenient. He hasn't shown any remorse, exactly. But he also hasn't shown any of the behavior we'd typically associate with intent to harm. He genuinely seems to believe he did nothing wrong. I asked her, finally. The question I'd been circling for days without letting myself say it directly. Did he ever explain why? What he actually wanted? Going into all those houses? She was quiet for a moment before answering. He said, she told me carefully, that he just liked knowing the houses were being taken care of properly. That's the closest thing to a motive he's given us. I moved out within 2 months, breaking a mortgage I'd only just settled into, at a financial loss that still stings when I think about it too directly. I couldn't stay in that house, couldn't sit in my own living room armchair without picturing Walter sitting in it during some quiet Tuesday afternoon. Couldn't open my closet without remembering those slightly shifted hangers. Couldn't wave back at a neighbor's porch again without feeling my whole body tense in anticipation of a familiar kind of warmth I no longer knew how to trust. The case against Walter resolved exactly the way the officer had predicted. A modest fine, a suspended sentence given his age and clean record up until that point, no jail time at all. I found this out secondhand, through the young couple next door, who I'd stayed loosely in touch with after moving. They told me Walter still lived in that same house, still waved at people from his porch every morning, apparently entirely unbothered by any of what had happened, carrying on with the same easy, grandfatherly presence he'd always had. I think about that unbothered quality more than almost anything else from that whole experience. Not the photographs, not the duplicate key, not even the footage of him sitting calmly in my chair. It's the fact that none of it seemed to register with him as wrong in any way. No defensiveness, no shame, nothing beyond a genuine, apparently sincere belief that he'd simply been looking after people. The way you'd look after property you felt some quiet, unspoken claim to. I've tried, in the time since, to build some kind of explanation I can actually live with. There's a version I can almost accept on calmer days. A lonely, aging man, recently widowed by the time I met him, who filled some deep and genuine need for connection and purpose by inserting himself quietly into other people's domestic lives, never intending harm exactly. Simply never developing whatever boundary most people carry instinctively around what belongs to someone else. Sad, in its way, more than purely sinister if I let myself see it from enough distance. There's another version, harder to sit with, that surfaces sometimes late at night in whatever place I'm currently living. That the calm, the photographs, the years-long pattern across multiple houses weren't about loneliness at all, but about something closer to ownership. A quiet, patient conviction that the houses on that street and the lives inside them existed partly for him to observe, catalog, and maintain. Whether their actual occupants knew it or not, I live somewhere else now, a rental this time, And I've never given a spare key to anyone since. Not a neighbor, not a friend, not even family visiting from out of town. It's become a small, immovable rule I carry with me. One I've stopped trying to explain to people who ask, because saying it out loud always circles back to the same uncomfortable truth, that the version of trust I used to extend so easily to kind, familiar faces isn't something I know how to fully rebuild anymore. Not after learning exactly how far that kindness could reach. Quietly, patiently, for years, without me ever once suspecting it was there. All right, let's move on to the next story. Like many of the others, it starts with an ordinary moment that slowly turns into something impossible to forget. My name's Dana. I'm 29, and I do remote project work for a marketing firm, which is basically the only reason I could afford to rent the house. I did a narrow 2-story place in Ballard, up in Seattle, the kind with hardwood floors that creak in specific spots, and a landlord who assured me the vintage charm included a landline jack in every room. I'd moved in about 6 weeks earlier, right after a breakup that ended the lease I used to share with someone, and honestly, those first few weeks were fine. Quiet even. The kind of quiet I actually wanted. There was an old rotary-style phone sitting in the kitchen when I moved in. Not rotary exactly, more like a corded phone from the 90s, beige, slightly yellowed with age. I never touched it. I don't think I even plugged it in, if I'm being honest, or at least I didn't remember doing so. It was just part of the furniture that came with the place, like the mismatched dining chairs and the weird cabinet in the hallway that didn't quite close all the way. It was a Tuesday when it rang for the first time, 17 p.m., I remember, because I'd just glanced at the microwave clock in the kitchen right before it went off. That shrill, old-fashioned ring cutting through the quiet in a way that made me actually jump a little at my own kitchen table. I stood there for a second, genuinely confused, since as far as I knew, that line wasn't even active. I picked it up anyway, more out of reflex than anything. There was no voice on the other end. Just breathing slow, deliberate. The kind of breathing that sounds almost deliberately controlled, like someone working hard to keep it even. I said hello twice. Got nothing back but that same steady rhythm, and eventually just hung up, laughing a little at myself in the empty kitchen. Wrong number, I figured. Some old landline glitch, a crossed wire somewhere in a building that clearly hadn't been rewired properly in decades. I didn't think about it again until the next night, when the same phone rang at exactly 11:17. 2 hours later than the first call, which should have told me something right away, except my brain was still stuck on treating it as random. Same breathing, same slow, even rhythm on the other end, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. I remember standing in my kitchen that second night, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the first real flicker of unease work its way up the back of my neck. Not because of what I was hearing exactly, but because of how deliberate it felt. Wrong numbers don't usually call back at almost the exact same time, one night after another. I did what I imagine most people would do. I looked up the number that had shown on the caller ID both nights. It just read, unknown caller, no digits at all, which struck me as odd enough that I called my phone provider, thinking maybe there was some simple glitch with caller ID display I didn't understand. The woman on the line took a while to get back to me after checking something on her end, and when she did, her tone had shifted slightly, more careful than the breezy customer service voice she'd started with. She told me that landline, the one in my kitchen, had been disconnected from service over 3 years earlier. Not suspended, not on hold, fully deactivated. The account closed out entirely. As far as her system was concerned, it wasn't even physically capable of receiving a call. There was no active line running to that jack at all. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking at that old beige handset sitting quietly in its cradle, and feeling something cold settle low in my stomach. If the line was dead, if it genuinely couldn't ring, then what exactly had I been listening to 2 nights running? I told myself, walking away from that call, that there had to be some explanation. The phone company just didn't have visibility into maybe a shared line issue with a neighboring unit. Some old wiring quirk from when the house had been split into apartments decades back. Crossed signals bleeding through from somewhere else entirely. It felt thin, even as I thought it. But it was better than the alternative, which I didn't want to sit with for very long. 2 nights later, right around when I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps. Not from the phone. From outside, out past my bedroom wall. The particular hollow echo of footsteps on the shared walkway that ran along the side of the house toward the front door. I froze mid-motion, one sock half off, listening hard, and the steps seemed to pause right around where the front door would be. I made my way to the front hallway as quietly as I could, heart going harder than it needed to, and pressed my eye to the peephole. Empty. Just the porch, the dark street beyond it, nothing moving at all. But the motion sensor light over my front step, the one that only triggers when something crosses close enough to set it off, was already on, casting its pale glow across an empty porch, like whatever had tripped it had simply vanished the second before I got there to see. For a long time that night, watching the empty porch, the sensor light eventually clicking off on its own timer after a minute or so of nothing moving at all. I told myself, going back to bed, that it had probably been a cat or a raccoon or one of the neighborhood possums that occasionally got into people's bins around here. Something small enough to trip the sensor and duck out of sight before I made it to the door. Seattle nights get plenty of that kind of wildlife traffic. It wasn't an unreasonable explanation. I just didn't quite believe it, not fully, lying there afterward, with my eyes open in the dark. The calls kept coming, though, every night after that, always at 11:17, never a minute off. I started to notice the pattern properly around the sixth night. Not just the timing, but the ritual quality of it, like something being performed, rather than something happening by accident. I began keeping the corded phone unplugged during the day, plugging it back in each night, almost against my own better judgment. Some compulsive need to know whether it would still ring, even when I controlled the connection myself. It always did, every single time. On the eighth night, something changed. I picked up at 11:17, expecting the same slow breathing I'd grown almost used to by then, and instead, a voice came through low, hoarse, deliberately quiet in a way that made every hair on my arm stand up. I'm outside. I don't remember consciously deciding to move. I just remember finding myself at my living room window seconds later, heart slamming, scanning the dark street in front of my house for any sign of movement. Nothing. No figure on the sidewalk, no car idling at the curb, no shift of shadow anywhere along the block. Just street light, and that particular thin Seattle mist that hangs low most nights, and total, undisturbed stillness. I stood there for what felt like a long time, phone still in my hand, watching that empty street through the glass, waiting for something, anything to move. That's when my cell phone buzzed on the counter behind me. A text. No name attached, just a number I didn't recognize. Don't look at the front. Still for a second. Phone screen glowing in my hand. My brain doing this frantic loop trying to make the timing make sense. I had just looked at the front of the house, not 5 seconds earlier. Not in some vague general sense, but specifically, deliberately, standing at that exact window scanning that exact street. And now this message, arriving seconds after, telling me not to do the one thing I'd just finished doing. That was the moment the fear shifted into something different, something that didn't have an easy shape to it anymore. It wasn't just that someone was calling. Someone was outside. It was that whoever this was could apparently see me, not just hear about my reaction secondhand, not guess at it, see it in real time, closely enough to send a message timed to exactly what I'd just done. I backed away from the window like it had turned hot, pulling the curtain shut with hands that weren't entirely steady, and sat down hard on my couch, staring at that message until the screen dimmed and went dark on its own. I didn't sleep much that night, running through everyone who might conceivably want to do something like this to me. The obvious name that came to mind was my ex, Marcus, 6 weeks out from the breakup. Someone who'd gotten a little too invested in tracking my location during the last stretch of our relationship, enough that it had been part of why I'd finally ended things. It fit a narrative I already had ready-made in my head, and I clung to it, honestly, because having a suspect felt infinitely better than having none. I called him the next afternoon, keeping my voice as steady as I could, laying out what had been happening without quite accusing him outright. He sounded genuinely confused, then increasingly alarmed on my behalf as I described it. And when I finally asked, directly, if this was somehow him, he went quiet for a second before saying flatly that he'd been at his sister's place in Colorado for the past 2 weeks, that he could prove it if I needed him to. Flight confirmations. His sister on the phone right now, if I wanted. I believed him. I think some part of me had known, even asking, that it probably wasn't him, The timing, the specificity, the sense of being watched in real time. None of it matched the pattern of someone I already knew. But believing him meant I was back to nothing. No suspect, no explanation. Just an empty street, a message telling me not to look at it. And 14 more nights, as it would turn out, still ahead of me. I decided I needed something more than locked doors and a drawn curtain. I ordered a small battery-powered security camera, the kind that syncs to an app on your phone, and mounted it deliberately, almost defiantly over my back door instead of the front. If someone wanted me watching the wrong entrance, I figured the right move was to watch the one they clearly didn't want me focused on. That night passed without incident, at least as far as I could tell Liv. The phone rang at 11:17, same as always, same slow breathing, nothing more. I checked the back camera feed obsessively for the rest of the night anyway, finding nothing but my own small dark backyard, undisturbed. It was the next morning, scrolling back through the overnight footage with my coffee going cold beside me, that I found what I'd been both dreading and somehow needing to see. Starting at 11:10, 7 minutes before the phone rang, a figure appeared at the edge of the frame near my back door. A man, from what I could tell, dressed in dark clothing, a hood pulled up obscuring most of his face. He didn't move much. He stood close against the door, motionless except for small, occasional shifts, and stayed there. The timestamp confirmed it. I'd running steady in the corner of the frame until 11:25, a full 15 minutes, 8 minutes after the call had ended upstairs. And in his hands, held low near his waist, was a phone. I watched, frozen at my kitchen table, as his thumb moved across the screen in small, deliberate motions, typing. It took me a long moment to fully absorb what that meant. He wasn't at the front of my house feeding me that message about not looking there. I was standing at my back door the entire time, the same door I'd only just started watching, the one I'd been told, indirectly, not to worry about. While whatever front presence I thought I'd sensed through footsteps and sensor lights might never have been a real person there at all. Which meant either there were two of them, working in some coordinated rhythm I didn't understand, or the footsteps, the sensor light, all of it at the front door had been staged somehow, engineered specifically to keep my attention pointed the wrong way while he worked, undisturbed, at the door with the weaker lock. I sat with that thought for a long time, my coffee fully cold now, staring at a paused frame of a hooded stranger standing at my back door, typing on a phone in the exact window when mine had been ringing upstairs. The earlier footage too, going back through everything the camera had recorded since I'd installed it. And that's when I found the detail that unsettled me even more than the figure itself. He hadn't just appeared that one night. He'd been there every single night since I'd started recording. Same spot, same stillness, same fast and 15-minute window clustered around 11:17, going back as far as the camera's storage allowed, which was only 3 days since I'd installed it late and hadn't thought to check the earlier footage until now. 3 days confirmed, but the calls had been going on for 9. I sat with that math for a long time, feeling something shift in how I understood all of this. If he'd been standing at that door every night, the phone rang, going back to the very first call, the one on that very first Tuesday, before I'd even thought to be afraid of anything, then this had never really been about me finding him. He'd been there from the start, which meant, unsettlingly, that whatever this was, it might not have started because of anything I'd done or been targeted for specifically. It felt, suddenly, much larger than just me. Like I'd simply moved into the middle of something that had already been happening. To this house, or maybe to whoever lived here before me, long before I'd ever signed a lease. That thought sent me down into the basement that same afternoon. Somewhere I'd avoided since moving in, mostly out of simple distaste for cobwebs and old concrete rather than any specific fear. The fuse box and utility lines ran along one wall, and it took some searching in the dim light before I found it. The old phone line, the one my provider had confirmed was deactivated 3 years earlier, except it wasn't just sitting dead in the wall the way it should have been. There was a length of new wire, clean, unweathered, clearly recent, spliced directly into the old junction box. It ran along the basement wall, up through a gap near the foundation, and out as far as I could trace it with a flashlight pressed against the small gap toward the back of the house, toward exactly where that camera had been recording a figure standing every single night. Someone had wired that deadline back to life themselves, manually, running a direct connection from wherever they stood outside straight into my kitchen phone, bypassing any actual telephone company or network entirely. It had never gone through any exchange. It had never been traceable, because there was, technically, no service involved at all. Just a wire, running through my own basement wall, connecting a stranger, standing in my backyard directly to a phone sitting quietly in my kitchen. I called the police that same evening. I took it seriously, more seriously than I expected. Actually walked the basement with me, photographed the spliced wire, made a call to have someone from the phone company come verify what I'd found. He told me carefully that given the pattern, the consistent timing, the sustained presence at the back door, the deliberate rerouting of a supposedly dead line, this read less like a random prowler and more like someone who'd been planning, or maintaining, this setup for a long time. He recommended I stay somewhere else that night, while they arranged additional patrols on the street, and honestly, I didn't need much convincing. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's place across town, but I kept the camera app open the whole drive, some compulsive need to keep watching, even from a distance. Nothing happened that night, at least nothing. The camera caught no figure at the back door, no call at 11:17 that I was aware of, since I wasn't there to answer the landline at all. The stillness of that night unsettled me almost as much as the pattern had. I lay awake on my friend's couch, phone propped against a pillow, watching an empty, quiet backyard feed hour after hour, waiting for something to happen and half convincing myself by around 2 in the morning that maybe it really was over, that whatever this had been, my involving the police, had finally been enough to make it stop. I went back the next day, only to grab more clothes, moving quickly, uneasily, through a house that no longer felt entirely mine. The officer had left a card with a direct line, told me to call immediately if anything else happened, day or night. 2 nights later, staying again at my friend's, I checked the app around 11 out of habit, and my stomach dropped clean through the floor. The figure was back. Same hooded silhouette, same stillness, standing at my back door in a house I wasn't even sleeping in anymore. Which meant he either didn't know I'd left, or worse, somehow it didn't matter to him whether I was there or not. I called the officer's direct line immediately, my hands shaking so badly I had to try the number twice than I expected. Lights off as instructed, so as not to spook anyone off before they could actually see something. I stayed on the phone the whole time, watching the live feed from my friend's living room, my whole body wound so tight it ached. The figure didn't move much, same patient stillness as always, until the officer's flashlight swept across the yard, and then, in an instant, he was gone. Not walking away, just gone, cutting across the frame's edge and out of the camera's narrow field of view faster than the footage could clearly follow. They searched the yard, the alley behind it, the neighboring properties. Nothing. No one found. No trace beyond the wire in my basement and hours of grainy, hooded footage that told them everything and nothing at the same time. I moved back into the house after that, mostly because I had nowhere else to realistically go long-term, though nothing about being there again felt safe in the way it once had. The calls didn't stop. If anything, over the following days, they intensified, though not in volume, just in that particular quality of dread that builds when something keeps happening exactly on schedule, no matter what you do to stop it. On what turned out to be the 13th night, I sat in my bedroom with every light off, watching the backdoor camera feed on my phone, waiting for 11:17. The way you'd wait for a scheduled thunderclap you already knew was coming. The police were on their way. I'd called ahead that evening, explained the pattern, asked if they could simply be present, watching, before anything even started. 11:16 came and went. The seconds ticked toward 11:17, and for the first time in 13 nights, the corded landline downstairs stayed completely, utterly silent. My cell phone lit up instead, buzzing once against the nightstand. A text. Same unregistered number as before. They're almost there. I have to go now. But I'll call the next tenant. I stared at that message until the words blurred, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then, with hands that wouldn't quite steady, I pulled up the back camera feed one more time. The yard sat empty, undisturbed. Just dark grass, the faint outline of the fence, nothing moving anywhere in frame. But the motion sensor light above the back door was on, glowing faintly across that empty space, meaning whatever had triggered it had only just left. Seconds, maybe less, before I looked. Property again that night, more thoroughly this time, and found nothing beyond what we already knew: the spliced wire in the basement, now cut and removed by the phone company technician who'd finally come out to properly disconnect it for good. No footprints that led anywhere conclusive, no trace of who he was or where he'd gone. Just an empty stretch of grass and a case file that, as far as I know, was never fully closed. I moved out within the month. I couldn't make myself sleep another full night in that house. Not after that message. Not after understanding that whatever this had been, it had never really been personal to me at all. That line, "I'll call the next tenant," has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those 2 weeks. Precisely because of how calm it was. How certain, like he'd simply been doing a job that had a beginning and an end, that had nothing to do with who happened to be living there when it started. There are explanations offered, the kind you reach for so you can eventually function again. A detective suggested it might have been an elaborate, sustained harassment campaign by someone with technical know-how and an unhealthy fixation on that specific house. Someone who'd perhaps lived there once, or wanted to, and had simply chosen me as this particular chapter's unwilling participant. Someone else, a friend, gentler in her theorizing, wondered if isolation after my breakup had made me more attuned to fear than I otherwise would have been. Though even she admitted that didn't explain the spliced wire, the timed messages, the camera footage that had genuinely, undeniably captured someone real. I heard, through a mutual contact who still lived in the neighborhood, that the house was rented out again a few months later. I don't know the new tenant's name. I don't know if the calls started again at 11:17 on their first night there, the way that final message had promised. I've thought about reaching out, warning them somehow, and then talked myself out of it every time. Telling myself it isn't my business anymore. That I did what I could, that the wire is gone now, and whatever made it possible has presumably gone with it. But I still check the time obsessively, wherever I live now. Whenever the clock creeps toward 11:17, I still keep landlines disconnected in any place I rent, unplugged at the wall, no matter what the landlord says about vintage charm. And some nights, lying awake in an apartment with no basement, no old wiring, nothing at all connecting me to that house anymore, I find myself wondering whether somewhere out there, in a house I used to call home, a phone is ringing right on schedule for someone who has no idea yet what that sound is about to mean. And if you thought that was the creepiest story of the night, wait until you hear this one. I bought my first house last spring, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet suburb of Tacoma, the kind of place with a 2-car garage and a yard just big enough to make home ownership feel like a real milestone, rather than just a bigger rent payment. I'm a software engineer, 34, single, the kind of person who genuinely enjoys setting up new tech more than is probably healthy. There'd been a string of minor break-ins reported in the neighborhood Facebook group that spring, nothing violent. Just a few garages hit for tools and bikes, and it gave me the excuse I'd been looking for to install a proper security system. I went all in. 4 cameras, front door, backyard, side of the house, and the garage all networked to a single app with AI-based motion detection. The kind that's supposed to distinguish a person from a cat, a car, a branch waving in the wind. I spent an entire Saturday mounting them myself, adjusting angles, testing the app's notification settings, feeling genuinely proud of the setup by the time I finished. I remember thinking, checking each camera's live feed, one last time before bed that first night, that I'd basically solved the whole problem. Modern tech, properly configured, doing exactly what modern tech is supposed to do. The first night, the app pinged twice both times, checking the footage. Just the neighbor's tabby cat cutting across my backyard. Exactly the kind of false positive I'd expected the AI to filter out eventually as it learned the property better. I laughed it off both times. A little oversensitive, maybe, but basically working as intended. It was the third night that something small happened. Small enough that I almost didn't think twice about it. Around 2 a.m., the app pinged with a motion alert from the back camera. I checked it half asleep, expecting the cat again, and instead found a completely still, empty frame. No cat, no branch, nothing visibly moving at all. I told myself it was probably wind rustling a dead branch just outside the camera's field of view, enough to trigger the sensor without anything actually showing up clearly in frame. It's the kind of thing that happens with motion sensors, especially outdoor ones exposed to weather. What actually stuck with me, lying back down afterward, was something I only fully clocked because of my own job. I pulled up the 10 seconds of buffer footage the camera captures right before a motion event. Triggers footage meant to show exactly what caused the sensor to fire in the first place. There was nothing in it. No branch swaying, no shadow passing, nothing moving at all in the frame during those 10 seconds before the alert. Motion sensors work by detecting pixel changes between frames. Something has to move to trigger one, which meant if nothing was visible in the pre-alert buffer, whatever had caused that motion event had already finished moving and gotten fully out of frame. In less time than the camera needed to start recording, I lay awake for a while, turning that over, engineer brain trying to make it make sense before exhaustion won out and I fell back asleep. Telling myself it was probably some processing lag in the camera's buffer system. A bug. Nothing more. Nothing happened for the next 2 nights. No alerts at all, beyond one more brief flicker from the cat, which I actually found reassuring in a strange way. Like the system had course-corrected itself back to normal. I stopped thinking about the empty back camera clip almost entirely, chalking it up to exactly the kind of processing quirk I dealt with in code every day at work. Software has edge cases. This felt like one of them. Then came the 5th night. I was asleep, deep enough that it took a while for my phone to actually wake me. Not one notification, but a continuous, overlapping buzz. The specific rhythm of an app firing alert after alert in rapid succession. I fumbled for my phone half-panicked, and by the time I got the app open, the notification list was already scrolling past faster than I could process it. 32 motion alerts in just under 40 minutes, cycling through all 4 cameras in a pattern that made my stomach drop the longer I watched it. Front door, side of the house, backyard, garage, then front door again, side, back, garage, not random, not scattered, but methodical, almost rhythmic, like something moving in a deliberate loop around the entire perimeter of my house, testing each camera in turn. I scrolled through clip after clip, hands shaking slightly with a mix of adrenaline and disbelief, and most of them showed exactly what that first strange clip had shown. Empty frames. Nothing visibly moving. Motion triggered by something that had already left frame before recording caught up. But one clip from the side of house camera, right in the middle of that long sequence, showed something different. A 1.5 of footage. A person's arm, sleeve dark and long, definitely human, disappearing around the corner of the house, right at the exact moment the frame cut back to empty. I sat up fully in bed, phone gripped tight, staring at that 1.5-second clip on a loop, watching that sleeve vanish around the corner over and over, trying to convince myself of something, anything, that wasn't the obvious conclusion sitting right in front of me. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I think it says something about how badly I needed this to be a technical problem rather than a human one. I spent the entire next evening hours, well past midnight, combing through the camera system's software logs, checking for bugs, downloading a firmware update. I found buried in a forum thread about phantom motion triggers on this exact model. I told myself the whole time that I was being thorough, methodical, the way an engineer solves a problem. What I was actually doing, I understand now, was refusing to accept that someone had spent 40 minutes circling my house in the dark. Because accepting that meant admitting the entire security system I'd been so proud of. The whole investment I'd made in feeling safe in my own new home hadn't actually done the one thing I'd bought it to do. The firmware update didn't change anything, which I suppose I already knew it wouldn't. Somewhere underneath the part of me still hoping for a technical explanation. The alerts continued at a low, sporadic rate over the following 2 nights, nothing like the frantic 32 alert sequence, just the occasional single ping here and there, always resolving to an empty frame, always with nothing visible in the pre-alert buffer. It was going back through those individual clips, actually studying them properly, instead of just skimming for a jump scare, that I noticed the detail that unsettled me more than almost anything else so far. Every single motion trigger, without exception, happened at the extreme edge of each camera's field of view, never in the center of frame. Never anywhere a face or a clear silhouette might actually register. Just at the margins, the outermost few inches of each camera's coverage, exactly where you'd need to be standing if you wanted to trip a sensor without ever giving it anything usable to actually record. I sat with my laptop that night, pulling up the technical specs for each camera, mapping out their exact fields of view against a rough sketch of my property. And the realization that settled over me while I did it was worse than any single clip had been. This wasn't someone stumbling around my property in the dark, careless and hurried, the way you'd expect from an opportunistic thief. This was someone who had studied my camera placement, who knew, with real precision, exactly where each blind spot began and ended. Someone who must have watched this house, watched my cameras, long enough to map their coverage as thoroughly as I just had myself. Sitting at my kitchen table with graph paper and a ruler. That meant whoever this was hadn't started paying attention to my house on the night of that first empty clip. They'd been watching before that, possibly before I'd even finished installing the system at all. I didn't sleep much that night, lying awake running through every angle of that thought, unable to land anywhere that felt remotely reassuring. I thought about calling the police right then, in the middle of the night, and talked myself out of it with the same reasoning that had kept me quiet so far. 32 alerts and some grainy, ambiguous footage of an arm didn't feel like enough to justify an emergency call. Not when nothing had actually been taken. Not when no door had been forced. I told myself I'd keep monitoring it. I told myself if it escalated any further, I'd call properly then, with something more concrete to show them. I didn't yet understand how close further already was. 4 nights passed without a single alert after that, which should have felt like relief, and instead left me sleeping worse than the frantic 32 alert night had. Some part of my brain refusing to fully stand down from whatever alertness had settled into it. I found myself checking the app compulsively throughout each of those quiet days, refreshing the live feeds for no reason beyond needing to see, with my own eyes, that everything currently looked normal. On the 9th night since installing the system, I woke up on my own, without any alert at all. Somewhere close to midnight, out of a restlessness I couldn't fully explain. I told myself I'd just check the app once, confirm everything was fine, and go back to sleep. The garage camera's live feed showed a man standing motionless just inside the garage, back to the camera, arms hanging loose at his sides. I remember the exact, specific way my whole body went cold looking at that image. Not a jump of adrenaline, not a scream-worthy shock, just a slow, creeping wrongness. The particular horror of a still, ordinary-looking frame that should have been empty and wasn't. I scrubbed the timeline backward, hands unsteady on the screen, and found him already there, in that exact position, as far back as the footage would let me go without buffering. 11:40 p.m. Nearly 2 full hours before I'd happened to check. 2 hours, standing perfectly still, and not one single motion alert had fired the entire time. It took me a moment, sitting there with my heart slamming against my ribs, to understand why. The AI only detects motion. A person standing absolutely still, without shifting weight, without so much as a twitch, is functionally invisible to a system built entirely around detecting pixel changes between frames. He wasn't hiding from the cameras. He was standing in perfect, deliberate stillness, inside the one blind spot that mattered most, not a spot the camera couldn't see, but a stillness the camera's AI simply wasn't built to register as a threat. And that was when the other pieces fell into place all at once, in a rush that made me feel physically sick. Those 32 alerts, days earlier the frantic looping pattern across all 4 cameras hadn't been someone panicking or moving randomly in the dark. It had been reconnaissance. Deliberate, methodical testing of every camera's exact trigger radius, learning precisely how close he could get, at what angle, before each sensor would fire. He'd used that entire 40-minute stretch to map my own security system more thoroughly than I ever had myself. And tonight, he was simply putting that knowledge to use, standing in the one place, in the one posture. that let him remain completely undetected by anything except the raw, unalerted footage I happened to be looking at purely by chance. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, phone screen the only light in the room, watching that motionless figure on the live feed, my mind racing through options that all felt equally wrong. Call the police now, with a man simply standing in my garage, not breaking anything, not forcing entry. Would that even qualify as an emergency, or would I sound like someone panicking over a stationary shadow on a security camera? Go downstairs myself and confront him directly. Every instinct I had screamed against that idea the moment it formed. Stay exactly where I was and just keep watching, hoping he'd eventually leave the way he apparently had on other nights. While I sat there, paralyzed, the live feed showed him move for the first time in nearly 2 hours. Slowly, deliberately. He turned, just slightly, toward the interior door, the one connecting my garage to the mudroom just off my kitchen. A door I genuinely never thought twice about locking, because the garage itself had an exterior roll-up door I'd always assumed was the real barrier between my house and the outside world. I watched him reach out one hand and settle it on the doorknob. I don't fully remember deciding to move. I remember being on my feet, phone still gripped in one hand, moving fast and near silent down the stairs, through my dark kitchen, until I was standing directly on the other side of that same door, closer to him, in that moment, than I had been to any threat in my entire life, separated by nothing more than a few inches of hollow interior wood. I stood there, barely breathing, phone screen still showing his live feed in my peripheral vision, watching in real time as the doorknob in front of me, the actual physical knob, not just the one on my screen, turned slightly, testing. It stopped, didn't force further, just that one slow, exploratory twist, and then stillness again on both sides of that door, for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of silence, where I couldn't tell if he could hear my own ragged breathing as clearly as I imagined I could hear his. I didn't call out. I didn't turn on a light. I stood there, frozen, staring at a doorknob in the dark, feeling my heartbeat in my throat, waiting for something, anything that would tell me whether the next sound I heard would be him leaving, or him trying that handle again with more intent. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that my legs started to ache from staying so rigidly still. Long enough that the phone in my hand had dimmed twice from inactivity, before I remembered to tap it awake again, terrified the whole time that even that small motion might somehow give me away, through a door I knew, logically, was solid and soundproof enough that it shouldn't matter. The doorknob didn't move again. I checked the live feed obsessively, glancing down every few seconds, watching him standing there on the other side, motionless once more, hand no longer on the handle, but simply hanging back at his side the way it had been for those first 2 hours. I didn't dare go back upstairs. I didn't dare do anything except stand there, back against my own kitchen counter, watching that small screen, waiting. At some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when, because time had stopped meaning anything normal. By then, the sky outside the kitchen window started to shift. That first faint graying that comes before actual sunrise. Still hours from full daylight, but enough to change the quality of the dark. On the garage camera's feed, I watched a thin line of that same pale light creep in through the gap beneath the garage's exterior door. And the moment it did, he moved. Not hurried, not startled by the light, the way you'd expect from someone worried about being caught. He simply turned, unhurried, toward the exterior door, and let himself out through it the same way, I assumed. He must have let himself in walking, upright, entirely unbothered, out of frame and into whatever thin, early light waited outside. Gone. Just like that. The way every previous appearance had ended, not fleeing, not panicking, just finishing, like a task completed on schedule. I finally sat down on my own kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, and let myself shake for a long time before I trusted my hands enough to call the police. 2 officers came out that morning, walked the garage thoroughly, checked the exterior door for any sign of forced entry, and found nothing. No pried locks, no broken glass, no footprints in the gravel drive, though a light rain overnight had apparently washed away anything that might have been there. They were careful, professional, took my footage seriously enough to copy it for their own records. But I could see, in the careful way they phrased things, that without physical evidence of a break-in, there wasn't much of an active investigation they could actually build. "We'll increase patrols through here," one of them told me, kindly enough. "But without any property damage or theft, and no clear identification from the footage, there's not a lot more we can do beyond that right now." I thanked them, locked every door in the house that had a lock, and sat down that afternoon to do the thing I'd been avoiding since that very first, unsettling empty clip 5 nights earlier. I went back through the entire history of footage, from the very beginning. I started from day one, the very first night I'd installed the cameras, back before any of this had felt like anything other than a proud new homeowner testing out his fancy new tech. I scrubbed through hour after hour of largely uneventful footage. The neighbor's cat, headlights sweeping across the driveway from passing cars, ordinary shadows shifting with the moon. It was in the garage camera's footage from that very first night, time-stamped only a few hours after I'd finished mounting all 4 cameras and gone to bed feeling pleased with myself, that I found him. Same posture, same stillness. Standing just inside the garage, back to the camera, arms hanging at his sides, exactly the way I'd find him again, 9 nights later. Except this time, the timestamp made my hands go cold in a way that no amount of explaining could soften. He'd been there before I ever noticed anything strange at all. Before the first empty motion clip, before I'd even had a reason to think my house needed watching, someone had already been standing in my garage, the very same night the cameras went live, as if he'd known, somehow, exactly when the system would be operational, and had simply been waiting for the moment it switched on to make his first appearance. I sat with my laptop for a long time after finding that clip, feeling something colder than fear settle into my chest, a kind of vertigo. The specific sensation of a timeline you thought you understood, suddenly extending backward much further than you'd ever accounted for. It meant this wasn't reactive. It meant he hadn't been drawn to my house by the cameras, or provoked by anything I'd done since moving in. It meant he'd already been watching, already been present, before I'd ever had a single reason to suspect anyone was there at all. I called the officer back that same afternoon and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of the careful, procedural neutrality from our earlier conversation. "That's concerning," she admitted. "I'll flag this footage specifically for our detectives. In the meantime, I really would recommend upgrading your security beyond what you currently have. New locks on that interior door, at minimum, and possibly a camera specifically inside the garage itself, given everything you're describing." I did exactly that within 24 hours. New deadbolt on the mudroom door. A 5th camera mounted inside the garage itself this time, angled to cover the space with no blind spots left for anyone to map and exploit the way he apparently already had with the first 4. I told myself, installing that camera with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking since the morning before, that this was the end of it. That whatever had been happening, it would stop now. Faced with a level of security that finally accounted for everything he'd already learned to exploit. I want to tell you I was right. The night after, I installed the new lock and the 5th camera. I slept in fits and starts, waking every hour or so out of pure habit to check the app, finding nothing, each time an empty garage, an empty yard, an ordinary quiet house, doing what ordinary quiet houses do at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. By morning, I let myself feel something close to steady for the first time in over a week. That feeling lasted exactly 1 day. The following night, a little after 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a single motion alert, not the frantic barrage from before, just one, isolated ping from the new garage camera. I remember the specific dread of reaching for my phone in the dark, the way my whole body had started associating that particular buzzing pattern with something my conscious mind hadn't fully caught up to yet. I opened the clip. The garage frame was empty, genuinely empty this time. No still figure standing in a corner, no arm disappearing around an edge. Just my car, parked where I always parked it, the concrete floor, the closed exterior door, everything exactly as it should have looked in the dead of night. Except, in the bottom corner of the frame, resting neatly on the hood of my car, was a phone. Not just any phone. My phone, or rather, an exact duplicate, same model, same case, positioned deliberately in the center of the hood. Screen lit and clearly visible even through the camera's grainy night vision. The screen was showing my own security app. Live. Streaming footage from inside my own bedroom. The camera angle catching me exactly where I actually was, in that moment sitting up in bed, phone in hand, staring at my real phone's screen with an expression I imagine mirrored the sick, sinking dread now spreading through my whole chest as I understood, all at once, precisely what I was looking at. A second phone, running the exact same app I used to watch my own house, showing him, in real time, that he was watching me watch him. I don't remember dropping my phone, though I found it on the floor beside my bed a few minutes later. Screen still lit. The clips still looping in an endless, silent loop of my own bedroom. Filmed from an angle that meant a camera had to exist somewhere in that room that I had never installed, had never authorized, had no idea was there at all. I didn't sleep in that house again. I spent the rest of that night sitting in my car in the driveway, doors locked, engine running for the heat. Phone gripped so tightly my knuckles ached, until the sky finally lightened enough that I felt safe walking back inside to grab a bag of essentials and leave. The police came back out that morning, and this time, the tone of the whole conversation changed. 2 detectives searched my bedroom themselves, checking every outlet, every vent, every small gap where a hidden camera might plausibly be tucked. They found a tiny pinhole lens embedded in the smoke detector above my bed, the kind sold openly online for a few dollars. Small enough that I'd walked past it 100 times without ever once looking closely enough to notice it wasn't quite original to the fixture. They took the smoke detector, took the phone that had been left on my car hood, wiped clean of prints, they told me later. No identifying information recoverable from it at all. A burner device bought with cash from some big box store, completely untraceable. They dusted the garage, the mudroom door, my bedroom, and found nothing else. No fingerprints anywhere that shouldn't have been there. No trace evidence beyond what he'd deliberately chosen to leave behind. I moved out within 2 weeks, breaking the mortgage arrangement in a way that cost me more than I want to think about, even now. Renting a small apartment in a secure building with a doorman and no windows facing any ground-level access at all. The case, as far as I know, remains open and unsolved. The detective who worked it told me in our last conversation that they had no leads, no matching cases in their system, nothing beyond a level of patience and technical sophistication that troubled her more than she wanted to admit directly to me. I've spent a long time since trying to build some kind of explanation I can actually function around. There's a version I can almost hold on to on calmer days. A deeply disturbed individual with genuine technical skill. Someone who fixates on properties during vulnerable transitional periods, like a new move-in, who happened to choose my house at random and happened to have the patience and knowledge to exploit a system I trusted completely. Frightening, but at least explicable. A person rather than something stranger. There's another version, quieter and much harder to sit with, that I turn over on the nights I still can't sleep in this new apartment, despite every lock, every camera, every precaution I've since layered on top of each other. That the choice was never random at all. That someone had been watching that house, that specific property, long before I ever purchased it, waiting patiently through however many previous owners for exactly the kind of new, technologically confident resident who would install a system just porous enough, just human enough, to eventually be turned back against himself. I don't work in home security anymore, not professionally, though I never had before either. But I no longer trust any system built entirely on trusting what a sensor decides counts as a threat. I check every smoke detector in every room I sleep in now, in hotels, at friends' houses, without fail, without exception, running my fingers along every scene before I let myself close my eyes. I know how it looks. I do it anyway. I still don't know how long he was actually watching me, cumulatively, across everything I never noticed. I've stopped trying to calculate it. Some numbers, I've learned, are better left unfinished. Don't relax just yet. The next story begins with something so small that most people wouldn't even notice it. That's what makes it so terrifying. I bought my first house in March. A 2-story craftsman in Wallingford with a finished attic and a backyard just big enough for my dog to actually run in. I know how that sounds, 31 years old. A house, a dog. Like I had my whole life figured out. I didn't. I'd scraped together the down payment mostly through luck and a small inheritance from my grandmother. And I remember standing in the empty living room the day I got the keys, feeling like an imposter. Like the house knew I didn't really belong there yet. I teach 4th grade at a public school a few miles away. And most nights, I also tutor 2 kids privately, which is the only reason I could afford this place at all. Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm out from 6 to 8. I mention that now because it matters later. Though at the time, it was just a schedule. The kind of boring detail you'd tell a stranger to make small talk. My dog is a border collie named Biscuit. He's 4. He's obsessively well behaved. And until that August, he had never once barked at nothing. I want to be clear about that, because it's going to sound like I'm exaggerating for effect. I'm not. Biscuit barked at squirrels, at the mail truck, at other dogs. He did not bark at empty rooms. That wasn't a thing he did. Not until it was. The house came with a lot of quiet problems. The way old houses do. The one I actually noticed first was the HVAC a wheeze and rattle from the vents whenever the heat kicked on, like something was caught in the ductwork. I found a repair service through an app, the kind with star ratings and verified reviews, and I booked the first available slot. The guy who showed up was named Gary, mid-40s, quiet voice, the kind of unhurried competence you don't see much anymore. He had a canvas tool bag that looked older than me, and this is such a small thing. But it's the reason I let my guard down completely. He brought dog treats. "I've got one just like him," he said, crouching down to let Biscuit sniff his hand before offering it. Border collies are too smart for their own good. Mine used to open the fridge. He fixed the unit in about 2 hours, explained what had been wrong in a way that didn't feel condescending. And before he left, he wrote his cell number on the back of his card. "Call me directly next time," he said. "Skip the app, it takes a cut. Old house like this, you're gonna have questions." I remember thinking finally, an honest guy in the trades. I didn't think about it again for 3 days. 3 days later, Gary texted me. I still have the message saved. Actually, I went back and reread it so many times afterward that the words are just burned into me now. "Hey, it's Gary from the AC job. Was in the neighborhood. Wanted to make sure that unit's still running quiet. Happy to swing by and take a look. No charge. Just don't like leaving a job half finished in my head, LOL." I remember smiling at that text. I remember thinking, this is what customer service used to look like before everything became an app with a tip screen. I said sure, and he came by that evening around 7. While I was still in my work clothes, grading papers at the kitchen table. I went in and out in just 15 minutes. He checked the machine, checked the filter, and told me it looked fine. Then he did something that seemed so normal to me at the time that I only later realized. It was strange. He took a short walk downstairs, commenting on the house. "People don't build houses like this anymore," he said, running his hand along the door frame between the kitchen and the living room. "You can see the structure is very good. The previous owner took very good care of this place." I said thanks, offered him a coffee, which he declined, friendly but not lingering. Biscuit sat by his feet the whole time, tail wagging, completely unbothered. I want you to remember that detail, because it's going to feel important later, and I need you to know it wasn't a warning sign yet. Dogs don't always know. Or maybe they do. And it just takes them longer than we'd like. The second free check-in came about a week later. Same casual text on the way. Stop by to see if there's anything else that needs fixing was basically the vibe of it, though obviously he texted in English. In the area again. Want me to peek at anything else while I'm here, no charge? I said sure, mostly because I liked the company, if I'm being honest. I'd been in the house alone for weeks by then, and having someone competent and calm walk through it, nodding at things, made it feel less like a project I didn't understand and more like a place I actually lived. This time he asked about the attic. Sometimes these old return vents run up through the attic space, he said. Might explain that draft you mentioned. I hadn't mentioned a draft. I remember a half second where I almost said that I didn't say anything about a draft. But then I second-guessed myself. Because who remembers every sentence of small talk from a week ago? Maybe I had said something. Maybe it was nothing. I let him go up. I was up there maybe 20 minutes. I sat downstairs, half listening to the creak of the floorboards over my head, moving in a slow, deliberate line back and forth, like someone pacing off measurements. When he came back down, he said the attic looked fine, dry, no issues, and that the draft was probably just the age of the windows. I thanked him. He left. Biscuit watched him go from the front window, not barking, just watching. In that focused way dogs do when they're cataloging something. I didn't think about that pacing sound again until weeks later, lying awake, trying to remember exactly how long it had lasted, and exactly what someone would need 20 minutes to do up there if they weren't checking a draft at all, for a while. Nothing happened. I want to be honest about that stretch, because it's easy to tell a story like this and make it sound like the dread was constant, building in a straight line from day one. It wasn't. There were almost 3 weeks where my life was just normal. I graded papers. I walked Biscuit around Green Lake on weekends. I went to my tutoring sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and came home to a quiet house and an excited dog and nothing else. I'd almost forgotten about Gary entirely. The AC ran fine. That should have been the end of it. The window was the first thing that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain away with old house. I am, and have always been, obsessive about locking windows before bed. It's a habit from childhood. My mother used to do a nightly circuit of every window in our house, and I picked it up without ever meaning to. So when I woke up one Wednesday morning in early September and found my bedroom window cracked open 2, maybe 3 inches, cold air sliding across the floor, I stood there for a solid minute just staring at it, running the previous night back through my head like a tape. I was sure I'd locked it. I was sure. But I'd also had a rough week parent-teacher conferences, a stomach bug that kept me up half of Monday night, and there's a specific kind of exhaustion where you start to doubt your own memory of doing completely automatic things. Did I lock my car? Did I turn off the stove? Did I lock the window? You can talk yourself into anything when you're tired enough. So I told myself you forgot. You were exhausted. It happens. I locked it again that night. Checked it twice, actually. Pressed my palm against the latch until I felt it click. And the next morning, it was closed. Fine. See, I'd just forgotten once. Everyone forgets things once. Then, 4 days later, it happened again. Not open as wide this time, just unlatched. Sitting flush in the frame, but not locked. The little metal arm swung to the side, and this time I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that I had locked it. I remembered locking it. I remembered the click. I didn't tell anyone about that yet. It felt too small, too easy to laugh off. What would I even say? Someone is coming into my house to unlock a window 2 inches and then leaving it exactly like that, doing nothing else. It sounded insane even inside my own head, so I said nothing. And I bought a little rubber doorstop wedge for the window track instead. The kind that physically blocks it from opening more than a crack, even if unlocked. A compromise with my own paranoia. A way to solve the problem without having to admit there was one. It was around this same time that Biscuit started with the attic. It started small. He'd trot to the bottom of the attic stairs, a narrow pull-down staircase in the upstairs hallway, right outside my bedroom door, and just stand there, ears up, tail stiff, not barking yet, just staring up at the closed hatch like he expected something to come down through it. I'd call him, and he'd ignore me for a few seconds longer than he ever had before finally trotting over, tail low, like he was doing me a favor. Then, about a week in, the staring turned into barking. Every night, almost to the minute, somewhere between 9 and 10. Not his normal bark, the sharp, two-note someone's at the door bark I was used to, but something lower, more sustained. A kind of rolling growl bark combination he'd never done before. I'd go check, every time, because that's what you do. And every time the attic hatch was closed exactly as I'd left it. And when I pulled it open and climbed the folding stairs with my phone flashlight, there was nothing up there but the same 6 boxes the previous owners had left behind. Old holiday decorations, a broken lamp, stuff I kept meaning to deal with and never did. There's nothing here, buddy, I told him more than once, standing in that cramped, dusty space with my phone light sweeping the corners. You're being weird. He'd stand at the bottom of the stairs, refusing to come up, whining low in his throat until I came back down. Here's the detail that didn't click for me until much later, and I think about it more than almost anything else in this whole story. He never barked at the stairs themselves. He barked at a spot, a specific corner of the ceiling, downstairs, in the hallway outside my bedroom, the exact patch of ceiling that, if you traced it upward through the floor of the attic, would put you directly above my bed. Not above the hallway, not above the bathroom, above the 6-by-7-foot rectangle where I slept every night. I didn't trace that out in my head at the time. I was just annoyed and a little unsettled, and mostly telling myself that dogs get weird sometimes, that maybe there were mice in the walls, that maybe the house was settling and making sounds only he could hear. All reasonable. All the kinds of things you tell yourself when the alternative is too big to hold. The camera was supposed to fix that. Mine. Not any system, just a small Wi-Fi camera I ordered online after one particularly bad night. The kind that clips onto a shelf and sends alerts to your phone. I told myself it was for peace of mind about the dog barking. Nothing more. I set it up in the living room, angled toward the front door and the base of the stairs. And for about a week, it caught nothing but Biscuit walking through frame and the occasional car light sweeping across the window at night. Then, one Thursday, I came home from tutoring a little after 8, and the little camera was dark, unplugged, not knocked loose. Not dangling, the cord had been pulled cleanly from the outlet and set down on the shelf next to the camera, coiled, almost neat, like someone had taken care not to leave it a mess. I stood in my living room, holding that cord for a long time, feeling the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Only 2 people had been inside that house with any regularity since I moved in. Me and Gary. I didn't call anyone that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the unplugged camera in front of me, and I did the thing I do when I'm scared and don't want to admit it. I got methodical. I opened my phone calendar and started scrolling backward, cross-referencing every day. I could remember something feeling off against my own schedule. The window, the first time a Wednesday. I'd had tutoring that Tuesday night, but not Wednesday. The second time the window was unlatched a Sunday. No tutoring at all. The camera goes dark, a Thursday. Tutoring night, 7 to 9. I stared at that pattern for a long time, moving pins around in my head, trying to make it mean nothing. 2 out of 3 isn't a pattern, I told myself. That's just Tuesdays and Thursdays. Everyone's home most nights and out some nights. It doesn't prove anything. But then I thought about how Gary would know my Tuesday-Thursday schedule at all, and my stomach did something unpleasant, because I remembered exactly when I'd mentioned it. His second visit, the free check-in, the one where he'd gone up to the attic about the draft, I never actually said out loud. We'd been standing in the kitchen while Biscuit sniffed his boots, and he'd asked, casually, what I did for work, and I'd told him 4th grade. And then, because it was true, and because it explained why I was a little tired that week, I'd added that I also tutored 2 evenings a week. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 to 8. A completely normal thing to say to a completely normal person doing a completely normal job in your kitchen. I sat with that for a while. Then I told myself, again, that I was being ridiculous. Gary had fixed my air conditioner. Gary brought dog treats. Gary was maybe 60 pounds heavier than the kind of man you picture breaking into houses. Soft-spoken. Worn reading glasses on a little chain around his neck. It felt insane to even be constructing this theory in my head. Like I was the unstable one, like I was the problem that weekend. I did some yard work. I'd been putting off clearing an overgrown patch near the back fence, close to the rear door, and under a low shrub, half buried. I found a fake rock, the kind you bought at a hardware store, hollow plastic molded and painted to look like granite, with a little sliding panel on the bottom. I hadn't put a spare key out there. I don't do that, my mother's other paranoid habit that I inherited, along with the window checking. I don't hide keys outside, ever. I slid the panel open with my thumb, already knowing, somehow, before I even saw it, what would be inside. A key, brass, a little tarnished, sitting in a small Ziploc bag to keep the damp out. I carried it to the back door with my hand actually shaking, and I put it in the lock, and it turned, smooth, like it had done this before. I sat down right there on my own back steps for a long time, because there was only one person who had ever spent unsupervised time in that backyard, who had ever been alone in that house long enough to walk out back, dig a little hole under a shrub, and bury a rock with a key in it. And it wasn't me. That night, I went back through the repair app, the one I'd booked Gary through, looking for anything his profile, his other reviews. Something that would either confirm what I was starting to believe, or finally, mercifully, disprove it. His account had been created 2 days ago. I first booked him. 0 prior jobs. 0 reviews under that profile. The 5-star reviews I saw seeing when I first searched the ones that made me trust him in the first place. I finally scrolled far enough to check the details, and they belonged to a different account entirely. Same first name. Different last name, different city, a profile photo of a much younger man. I closed the app and sat in my dark kitchen with biscuit pressed against my leg. And for the first time since I'd moved into that house, I was afraid to go upstairs to my own bedroom. I want to tell you that I called the police that night. I didn't. I keep turning that over. Even now, why didn't I? When I had a key in my hand that shouldn't have existed. A fake profile with a 2-day-old account. A pattern of intrusions that lined up almost perfectly with my schedule. I think the honest answer is that none of it, on its own, sounds like enough. A hidden key, an unlatched window, a camera someone unplugged and put down neatly instead of yanking it out and smashing it on the floor. I kept imagining myself on the phone with a dispatcher, trying to explain that my air conditioning repairman was possibly, stalking me, based on a rock. And I could hear how it would sound. Not urgent, not actionable. Just a woman who lived alone, getting spooked by an old house. So instead, I did something that, looking back, was either very brave or very stupid. And I still can't decide which. I decided to test it the following Thursday. I left for tutoring at my normal time, 6 o'clock. Same as always, except I didn't go to tutoring. I texted my 2 students' parents and canceled, citing a headache. And instead, I drove 3 blocks away, parked on a quiet side street where my car wouldn't be recognized, and walked back on foot along the alley behind my own row of houses, staying close to the fences, feeling like an idiot and also like I might throw up. I want to describe the quiet of that hour, because it's the part of this whole thing I still think about the most. Nothing happened for a long time. I crouched near a neighbor's fence with a clear sightline to my own backyard. Phone silent in my pocket. And the evening did exactly what evenings do in September in Seattle. The light went from gold to gray to that flat. Shadowless, almost dark. Sprinklers ticked on somewhere a few yards over. A dog barked twice, far off, and stopped. My own house sat there, dark and ordinary, porch light not yet on its timer. For almost 40 minutes, absolutely nothing happened. And that nothing was its own kind of unbearable. I remember thinking, this is insane. I'm going to go home and laugh about this. I imagined this whole thing. That's usually how these stories go, isn't it? The calm right before you wish you'd stayed in the car. At 6:41, a truck, I recognized Gary's truck, an older Ford, dark green. A magnetic sign on the door for a repair business I'd since learned didn't legally exist pulled up along the street on the far side of my house. Not directly in front of it. He parked half a block down, which struck me even in the moment as deliberate. You don't park half a block from a house you're visiting for legitimate reasons. You park in front of it. He got out. He didn't walk toward my front door. He didn't knock, didn't ring the bell, didn't do any of the things an actual contractor checking in on a job would do. I walked around the side of my house, along the narrow gap between my place and the neighbor's fence, moving with the unhurried, familiar pace of someone who has walked that exact path many times before, and disappeared toward my backyard. I stood frozen at the neighbor's fence line for maybe 5 full seconds before my hands remembered how to work, and I pulled out my phone, and I called 911. I kept my voice as low and steady as I could while I gave the dispatcher my address. Told her a man was trespassing on my property, that I believed he'd broken in before, that I was hiding nearby and could see him. She told me to stay where I was. Stay on the line. Don't approach. I have never been so grateful for a calm stranger's voice in my life. While I waited, I moved a little closer, close enough to see through a gap in the side fence into my own backyard. Gary was crouched near the shrub by the back fence, the exact shrub, the exact fake rock, sliding the little panel open with a familiarity that made my throat tighten. He wasn't fumbling. He wasn't nervous. He moved like a man doing a chore he'd done dozens of times, checking his phone once, unhurried, before straightening up with the key in his hand and walking to my back door. He slid it into the lock. I heard the small, specific click even from where I crouched, a sound I now associated only with my own hand doing that same motion. And something about hearing someone else's hand produce that exact sound made the whole thing suddenly sickeningly real in a way that no amount of thinking about it beforehand had managed. And then, from inside the house, I heard Biscuit, not his normal bark, not even the 2-note alarm bark I was used to. It was that same low, rolling sound he'd been making at the base of the attic stairs for weeks. Except now, it was coming from upstairs, from what I was almost certain was my bedroom window. And it wasn't aimed at the man standing at the back door at all. I could hear it clearly enough, even from the yard, to tell the direction was wrong. He wasn't barking down at Gary. He was barking up, toward the ceiling, toward the attic. The exact same spot he'd been barking at every night for a month. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I only understood that it was wrong, and that everything about that moment. A man opening my back door with a key he had no right to. My dog screaming at empty space above a room he'd never once acted afraid of. Before I moved in, belonged to some version of my house I hadn't known I was living in. The police arrived 4 minutes later, which felt like both no time at all and the longest 4 minutes of my life. 2 cruisers, no sirens, exactly like the dispatcher said they'd try to do, so as not to spook him into running. I stayed where I was, phone still pressed to my ear, watching from the fence line as 2 officers came around the side of the house, weapons still holstered but hands ready, and found Gary standing just inside my back door, 1 foot over the threshold. Keys my keys, apparently. A second set he must have copied at some point still in his hand. I don't remember a lot of the next few minutes clearly. I remember stepping out from behind the fence when an officer called out that it was safe. Remember my legs not quite working right. Remember Gary's face when he saw me, not fear, not anger. Something closer to disappointment, like I'd interrupted him partway through something he considered unfinished. What I remember most clearly, though, is what happened after they had him in handcuffs. when I finally found my voice enough to tell one of the officers about the dog, about the barking, about the attic. "He's been doing that every night for weeks," I said. "Right there, that spot." I pointed at the ceiling in the upstairs hallway, at the little pull-down hatch above it. "Can someone check?" The officer looked at me for a second too long before he radioed for backup to bring a flashlight up. I stood at the bottom of the folding stairs while an officer went up. And I remember Biscuit pressing so hard against my legs that I nearly lost my balance. Not barking anymore, just trembling, low to the ground, refusing to come near the staircase at all. That, more than anything else that happened that night, is the detail that still gets me. He'd been trying to tell me for a month. I just hadn't been able to hear it right. The flashlight beam moved around up there for what felt like a very long time before the officer said anything. When he came back down, his face had changed that particular calm. Careful blankness that I've since learned means someone is choosing their words to keep you from panicking before they've finished the sentence. There was a thin camping mattress up there, rolled out flat against the plywood flooring, tucked behind the row of holiday boxes so it wouldn't be visible from the hatch opening unless you actually climbed all the way up and looked. A few empty water bottles, lined up neatly against the wall. The same unsettling tidiness as the unplugged camera cord coiled on my shelf, and a spiral notebook cheap, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore filled with handwriting. I didn't get to read it that night. The detective who came out later told me it would need to be logged as evidence, and that I'd likely be asked to go over parts of it during the investigation, which was its own quiet horror. The idea that strangers in an office somewhere would read a record of my life that I'd never known was being kept. What I did learn, over the following days, in pieces, from the detective and later from the DA's office, was this: the notebook containing dates going back nearly 6 weeks, nearly 2 weeks before I'd even called him about the air conditioner. Times I left for work, times I came home, the 2 evenings a week. I was reliably out of the house for 2-hour stretches. Small, specific observations that had nothing to do with HVAC repair at all, what I wore on weekends, how long I walked the dog, what time my bedroom light usually went off. 6 weeks. He'd been watching the house, watching me for 2 weeks before that first service call even happened. Which meant the ad I'd booked him through, the profile with the fabricated reviews, hadn't been created to find a random job. It had been created, or at least activated, for me specifically, once he already knew enough about my schedule to make himself available exactly when I needed a repairman most. I keep coming back to that detail, because it inverts the whole story in a way I still haven't fully made peace with. I always assumed the fear started with the doorbell, that he found me because I happened to book a repair call. But the sequence doesn't support that. He found the house, or found me. First in the air conditioner, the visit, the treats for Biscuit, the friendly texts. All of it was never the beginning of anything. It was already the second act. I just didn't know the first one had happened at all. I moved out 3 months later. I told people it was because the house had bad memories now, which was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I couldn't sleep under that ceiling anymore. Not even after the mattress and the notebook and the water bottles were gone. Not even after a contractor, a real one, licensed. Someone my sister found through a friend and vetted herself before I'd let him near the place, came out to patch the attic floor. That's when we found the hole. It was small, almost elegant, in a way that made it worse, not a crude gouge, but a clean, deliberate opening drilled through the plywood subfloor and the drywall ceiling below it, maybe 3/4 of an inch across, angled slightly downward. The contractor found it while checking insulation, and he called me up to look before he patched it, because he said he'd never seen anything like it, and wanted to make sure I knew it was there before he closed it up for good. It was positioned directly above the head of my bed. I stood on a step stool with a flashlight and looked at that little dark circle in the ceiling for a long time, thinking about all the nights I'd fallen asleep with the lamp still on. Phone forgotten on my chest, and I have never in my life wanted so badly to unknow something. The detective told me, eventually, that Gary, not his real first name, it turned out, though I still can't make myself use the other one, had done something similar in a different city 4 years earlier. No arrest, no charges. The previous homeowner had moved out abruptly, sold the house at a loss, and never filed a formal complaint, which meant there was no record connecting the two cases until after mine, when someone finally cross-referenced his real name against a string of short-term addresses and half-documented complaints going back almost a decade. I don't know what he wanted. That's the part I still can't answer, even now. Even after sitting through a preliminary hearing and reading portions of that notebook that I was asked to confirm or deny, the prosecutor had a theory. My sister has a different one, my therapist, because yes, I see one now, twice a month, and I'm not embarrassed about that anymore. Thinks it's less important that I find the right answer than that I stop needing one before I can sleep again. Maybe it was about control. Watching a life from the inside without ever having to be seen. Maybe it escalates. For men like that, city to city, notebook to notebook. And I happen to be a chapter instead of an ending. Maybe there's something almost mundane about it. Some psychological profile a detective could recite in his sleep. And none of it would make the hole in my ceiling feel any less like a wound. I live somewhere else now. Different neighborhood. A one-story rental with no attic at all, which I know sounds paranoid. And I've made my peace with that. I check my windows every night. Twice, the way my mother used to. Except now I don't feel silly about it. I had a security company install cameras with battery backups that can't be unplugged from outside. And I still, most nights, find some reason to walk past every single one of the feeds on my phone before I let myself fall asleep. Biscuit sleeps in my room now, on the floor beside the bed instead of downstairs, which he never used to do. I don't make him move. The last piece of this, I haven't told anyone outside of the detective, because I genuinely don't know what to do with it. A few weeks after I'd moved, cleaning out an old phone I hadn't used since before all of it, I saw a notification preview flash across the lock screen from a number I recognized, the same number Gary used to text me from, the one that had been blocked and reported and, as far as I knew, disconnected months earlier. I didn't open it. I couldn't make myself. I only ever saw the preview line, the little gray text under a name I'd deleted. But the phone apparently hadn't fully forgotten. Your new place will need someone to look at the ductwork soon too. I turned the phone off. I haven't turned it back on since. Some nights, when the house is very quiet, I think about it sitting in a drawer, screen dark. And I wonder if that's the end of the message, or just the part I was willing to read. If you think that story was unsettling, don't go anywhere. The next one starts with something so ordinary that almost anyone would ignore it, until it was far too late. I replaced the whole fixture that weekend, climbed up with a ladder, and swapped it for a newer motion sensor, one with adjustable sensitivity. The kind that lets you dial down how much movement it takes to trigger it. I set it as low as it would view, figuring that would filter out anything smaller than, say, a raccoon, and stop whatever glitch was making it fire off for nothing. That night, at almost exactly the same time, the light came on again. I stood at my window, staring at that porch, genuinely unsettled now in a way the first 2 nights hadn't quite managed. If the sensitivity was really turned down that low, theoretically, it would take something large, a person, or an animal roughly that size standing close enough to trigger it at all, which meant either the sensor really was faulty in some deeper way than I understood, or something my own size had been standing right at my front door. It was while I stood there, curtain pulled back just slightly, that I noticed Mr. Walsh. I was standing at the edge of his own lawn across the street, hands in his coat pockets, same as always, looking directly at my house. Not at anything else my house, specifically. In that particular unmoving way he had. I gave him a small wave, more out of habit than warmth at that point. I didn't wave back. He just stood there another few seconds, then turned and went inside. I told myself that was nothing. Older neighbors keep odd hours sometimes. And there wasn't anything inherently strange about a man standing on his own lawn at night, looking in whatever direction he happened to be facing. I went to bed telling myself that story, and mostly believed it. Over the next week or so, I started, almost unconsciously, tracking the timing. I do design work. I like data. It's just how my brain works. And I noticed the light didn't trigger at a fixed time exactly, but always somewhere in that same narrow window between 11:30 and midnight. What unsettled me more, once I noticed it, was that the nights it triggered most, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times in an hour, were exactly the nights I happened to be up later than usual, working, or just unable to sleep. Almost like whatever this was only bothered showing up when it knew I was awake to notice. Mr. Walsh, I began to realize, was out on his lawn more often, on precisely those same busier nights. Not every night the light triggered, just the ones with multiple flare-ups. He never crossed the street, never came any closer, just stood there in the dim wash of the street lamp, watching my house, patient in a way that started to feel less like eccentricity and more like vigilance. I finally worked up the nerve to ask him about it one afternoon. Catching him out front, well, he was doing something with his mailbox. Some ordinary errand that gave me an excuse to cross the street casually, rather than making a whole production of it. "Hey, Mr. Walsh," I said, keeping my tone light. "I've noticed you out on your lawn some evenings. Just wondering, is everything okay?" He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable in that particular flat way older men sometimes have, and said, evenly, "I'm just checking whether your light's on." "My porch light?" I asked, a little thrown. "To know if I'm still in time," he said. I waited for him to elaborate. Some follow-up that would make that sentence land as ordinary neighborly comms, rather than whatever it actually felt like standing there in the afternoon sun. I didn't offer one. He just turned and walked back toward his own front door, leaving me standing on his lawn with a half-formed question still in my throat. I didn't push it. I went home, turning the exchange over and over, trying to find some comfortable interpretation that let me stop thinking about it. Maybe he just meant he liked to see lights on. Some old habit from a life with a wife who used to leave the porch light on for him. Some benign sentimental thing that had nothing to do with anything sinister. I wanted that to be true. I mostly managed to convince myself of it, for a few days at least. Then, for 3 nights running, the light didn't trigger at all. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I found myself lying awake each of those nights, waiting for it, unsettled in a way I couldn't quite justify to myself. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of it. I realized, however unpleasant, it had become a rhythm, something I could predict and prepare for. The silence felt different. It felt like something had paused, deliberately, rather than simply stopped. On the 4th night, I woke abruptly around 2 a.m. to a strange strobing light bleeding in through the gap in my curtains, not the single steady glow I'd grown used to, but rapid, repeated flashes, on, off, cycling faster than the fixture's default 60-second timeout should have allowed. I got up, moved to the window on legs that didn't feel entirely steady, and peered down through the narrow gap in the curtain at my front porch. I couldn't see anyone, but the light kept cycling on, off, a rhythm too, even to be whined. Too fast to be a person simply walking back and forth across the sensor's range. It went on for nearly 5 full minutes before it finally stopped. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after it stopped, phone gripped in my hand, too rattled to go back to sleep, listening to a silence that felt heavier than any silence had a right to feel. By the time morning came, I'd half convinced myself I could explain it away, some electrical fault causing the fixture to cycle on its own, a wiring issue I'd need an electrician to look at eventually. I wanted, badly, for that to be the whole story, but I still had that old camera mounted above the door, grainy as it was, and I pulled up the footage from that stretch of night with my coffee going cold beside me, my stomach already tight before I'd even pressed play. The footage confirmed the timing, the light cycling on and off in that same rapid, even rhythm. And each time it flared bright enough to properly illuminate the porch. There was a figure standing right at my front door, hand resting on the doorknob, testing it with a slight, careful twist, not hard enough to force it, just enough to check whether it was locked. And every single time the light reached its brightest point, he was gone from frame in less than a second. Not walking away, simply absent. The space where he'd been standing suddenly and completely empty, faster than any normal stride could have carried a person out of that camera's narrow field of view. I slowed the footage down, frame by frame, staring at it until my eyes ached. And the same impossible thing kept happening every time he didn't step out of frame. He was there, hand on the knob. And then, in the space of a single frame, he simply wasn't, as though the light itself had been some kind of test, a way of checking exactly how much brightness it would take before he'd be clearly visible, so he could retreat one beat ahead of ever actually being seen, even through the grain and the poor resolution. Something about the shape of him, the long wool coat, the particular hunch of his shoulders, made my skin go cold with recognition. It was Mr. Walsh. I sat there staring at that paused frame for a long time, my coffee completely forgotten, trying to reconcile the mild, quiet old man from across the street with what I'd just watched a figure testing my locked door in the dark, timed precisely to disappear before the light could fully expose him. I thought about calling the police right then, and part of me almost did. Except some other part, stubborn and unwilling to just hand this over without understanding it first, decided I needed to see it happen myself, in real time, before I trusted anything secondhand, even my own camera. I called the police anyway that afternoon, gave them what I had, and was told an officer would swing by to talk to Mr. Walsh directly. But that same evening, I also turned off every light in my house, sat down beside my living room window in the dark, and waited. It was 11:47 when I saw him cross the street. He moved with none of the hesitation I might have expected from someone who knew he was being watched, steady, unhurried. The same deliberate calm he always carried standing on his own lawn. He climbed my porch steps, reached for the doorknob, tested it with that same careful, practiced twist I'd already seen on the recording. The sensor light began its slow rise toward full brightness. These newer LED fixtures don't snap on instantly. They climb, a half second or so of gradually building glow, and I watched, my heart slamming against my ribs, as he waited until the exact instant before it reached its peak, then stepped back, turned, and disappeared into the dark stretch of trees behind his own property. Gone before the light finished climbing to its brightest point. I sat there afterward for a long time in the dark, hand pressed against my own chest, trying to steady my breathing, replaying that slow, deliberate retreat over and over. He'd known exactly how much time he had before that light would show him clearly. And he'd used every second of it, right up to the edge, without ever once letting himself be fully seen. The police went to speak with him the next morning, and I waited at home most of that day for some kind of update. My nerves stretched thin the whole time. When the officer finally called, his tone carried a strange, careful hesitation that told me before he even said anything that this wasn't going to resolve as cleanly as I'd hoped. Mr. Walsh hadn't denied any of it. He'd admitted, apparently without much prompting at all, to standing at my door those nights, testing the knob. But the explanation he gave wasn't the confession I'd braced myself for. I wasn't trying to get in, the officer relayed, reading from his notes. He says he was trying to make sure no one else had. Says someone else has been testing that same door, other nights, before he ever started. He claims he's just been checking to see if that person's already gotten there first. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the ground shift under whatever certainty I'd built up. It didn't fit the tidy, frightening story I'd assembled in my head. An obsessive old man finally caught in the act. It complicated things in a way that made everything worse rather than better. There wasn't enough, legally, to hold him. He hadn't actually attempted to force entry, hadn't broken anything, hadn't technically trespassed beyond a public porch. And when the door handle was examined for prints, the results only deepened the unease. Rather than resolving it, there were at least 2 distinct sets of prints layered across it, built up over what looked like multiple nights. meaning someone besides Mr. Walsh had genuinely been touching that same door at some point. In some capacity, neither of us could account for. I didn't know who to believe. Maybe he really was exactly what he claimed, a lonely, fixated old man who'd appointed himself some silent, unrequested guardian, standing watch over a neighbor he barely knew. Or maybe the story about someone else was simply the most convenient lie available to him. A way to explain his own behavior by inventing a second, unseen threat. The police told me to change my locks, install better cameras, and left it there because there wasn't anything more they could actually do. I changed the locks that same week. Bought a new camera system too. High resolution, adjustable sensitivity down to specific time windows. Determined to finally have proof solid enough that no ambiguity could survive it. The first night after installation. The porch light didn't trigger once. Not a single flicker. The first full quiet night in weeks. I almost let myself feel relieved. That relief lasted exactly as long as it took me to walk to my living room window that night. Glancing out one last time before heading up to bed, Mr. Walsh was standing in his usual spot across the street. Hands in his coat pockets, same as always. Except he wasn't looking at my house. I was facing the side of my property, toward that thin stretch of woods separating my backyard from the main road, the one direction with no camera coverage at all. No motion sensor. Nothing watching it whatsoever. He stood there, perfectly still, staring into those dark trees with an intensity that unsettled me far more than every previous night of him watching my front door ever had. I didn't sleep well that night, turning that image over and over the fact that whatever he'd been watching for at my door, he now seemed to be watching for somewhere else entirely. Somewhere I had absolutely no way of monitoring at all. A few nights later, the new camera caught something. The porch light triggered at 11:41, sharp and sudden. No gradual buildup this time, and when I pulled up the footage the next morning, the frame showed exactly what it should have, this time clear resolution. Sharp detail. Everything working the way it was supposed to. There was no one on the porch at all. I sat there scanning every inch of that clear, well-lit frame, confused more than afraid at first, until I noticed it right at the very edge, barely within the camera's field of view, a detail I genuinely never thought about since buying the house. The small basement window around the side, half hidden by an overgrown shrub, the one I'd always assumed was permanently sealed, painted shut from disuse long before I ever moved in. It was open, just a few inches. The gap sitting there dark and impenetrable. Nothing visible beyond it at all. I didn't go down to that basement window that night. I called the police again the next morning, told them what I'd found. And an officer came out to look at it with me, the frame genuinely pried. Old paint cracked along the seam where it had clearly been forced open from outside. Not recently either. Based on the way dirt and debris had settled into the gap. There was no way to say for certain how long it had been like that, or how many times it might have been used before I ever noticed. I had it sealed and reinforced within the week, along with new sensors along that whole side of the house for a while after that. The nights were quiet, no porch light triggering, no figure at the door, nothing on any camera at all. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that whatever had been happening had simply run its course, satisfied or scared off or moved on to somewhere else entirely. Mr. Walsh still stands on his lawn some evenings. I still wave sometimes, out of habit more than warmth now. He doesn't always wave back. I've never gotten a clearer answer out of him about any of it, and the police never found enough to charge him with anything, since standing on a public street and once testing an unlocked-looking doorknob doesn't amount to much in the eyes of the law. However unsettling the pattern felt from where I stood, there are explanations I've turned over since, the kind that let me function normally most days. A detective suggested Mr. Walsh might genuinely have appointed himself some kind of self-styled neighborhood watchman. A lonely, isolated man whose fixation on protecting me had curdled into something that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from the very threat he claimed to be guarding against. Someone else offered a colder theory that there really had been two separate people involved all along. Walsh and whoever else left those other prints on my door. and that we'd simply never identified the second person at all. Meaning whatever this was might not be finished. Just paused, waiting for its own moment to resume. I sleep with the bedroom door locked now, even inside my own house. I check that basement window every single night before bed, a habit I don't think I'll ever fully shake. And some nights, lying awake, I still catch myself watching the thin gap in my curtains, waiting for that particular pale glow to bleed through, half dreading it. And somehow, after everything, almost more afraid of the nights it doesn't come at all. My name's Emily. I'm 33. I do freelance graphic design from home. And about a year and a half ago, I bought a small house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac just outside Portland. It's the kind of street where everyone's lived there 15, 20 years, except me. And my house happens to be the only one on the block without a neighbor directly behind it, just a thin stretch of scrubby woods separating my backyard from the main road beyond. I remember thinking that was a selling point when I bought the place. More privacy, the realtor said. Less noise. There's a neighbor named Mr. Walsh who lives kitty corner across the street. A widower, somewhere in his 60s. The kind of quiet older man every cul-de-sac seems to have a little odd, generally regarded by everyone as harmless. He has this habit of standing out on his front lawn some evenings. Hands in his pockets, not doing anything in particular, just standing. I'd wave sometimes when I caught him out there. He didn't always wave back, but I never thought much of it. Every street has its own particular texture of strangeness, and he was mine. It started on an ordinary Tuesday, as far as I can remember. I was on the couch watching something forgettable around 11:40 at night when the motion sensor light on my front porch clicked on, its glow seeping in faintly through the gap in my curtains. I got up, glanced out, nothing. Empty porch, empty yard, no wind that I could feel through the window glass. I figured it was the neighbor's cat, the orange tabby that wandered the whole block like it owned it, and went back to my show without giving it a second thought. The next night, same thing happened. Almost the same time, 11:38. Close enough that it registered as a coincidence rather than a pattern. This time I went straight to the door, opened it within seconds of the light triggering. Nothing. No cat. No raccoon. No shape retreating into the dark. Just my quiet, empty porch and the cold night air. I checked the camera I already had mounted above the door, an old thing. Basic footage only. No smart detection, and it showed the same empty frame. No movement anywhere in view. I told myself the sensor must be glitching. Some cheap component finally wearing out after years in the Portland damp. That explanation felt sturdy enough to let me sleep.